Meet me over in Joshua 5 and 6. Joshua 5 and 6, that's right, you did hear me correctly. It is 2 whole chapters. Man, buckle up. We got a lot to cover because God has a lot to say to us. One big caveat here right at the jump of the sermon is I'm going to be doing a lot more summarizing today than I typically do, okay, just because we have so much material to cover. But do not fear, all you type A people. We're going to return to chapter 6 next week, okay, because there's just so much here. But I am going to be summarizing a little bit more. But I do think, man, God has so much to say to us this morning from these chapters, specifically about what faith actually is. Have you ever thought about that? What faith actually is? It's something that we talk about all the time in the church. If you've been around church, if you've grown up in church, man, it's this idea of faith. Man, we think about it, we nod our heads to it, we assent to it, we sing about it. But faith, man, is easy to talk about, but sometimes it is so much harder to show when it's tested, right? I once read about a guy named Charles Blondin. I'll put a picture of him here up on the screen, who in the summer of 1859 was dazzling crowds by walking over the Niagara Falls on a tightrope that was 160 feet above the roaring waters. And it was nearly a quarter-mile distance that he had to walk across this rope. Literally, okay, Thousands of people would pack on the shores to witness all of his daring feats because he would do this multiple times. He wouldn't just walk across once and then everyone would cheer. He would do it multiple times, and each time he would add a whole new twist to the whole thing. Like one time he walked across this thing blindfolded, which is insane to me, just absolutely insane. One time he did it on stilts. I showed my wife a picture last night. I said, man, this dude even was eating a meal. Like literally there's a table and it's like rolling across this thing. He's eating a meal while he's going across. One time he was cooking an omelet when he was walking across. It's just insane. Each time he completed the quarter-mile journey, the crowd would erupt in cheers, right? This is amazing. This is incredible. Look at this dude. So Blondin, one time he was doing this, he announced that for his final journey across, he was going to attempt to push a wheelbarrow across. And of course, they're like, of course he can do that. He can eat an omelet while he's going across this thing, okay? So he asked the crowd, how many of you think I can do it? And everyone cheered, of course you can do it. If Blondin can't do it, nobody can, right? They're just cheering, going crazy. So he walks across, and then he's got to get back across. So he says, all right, who thinks I can do it again? And they're all like, of course you can do it again. And then he looks at the crowd, and he says, okay, then who volunteers to get in the wheelbarrow with me? At which point, the crowd falls deathly silent. Because here's the deal. It's one thing to say you have faith. That's easy. It's a whole other thing to actually get in the wheelbarrow. It's one thing to look at this dude walking across and say, yes, he can do it. That is possible. But it's a whole other thing to entrust your whole self to that person. And listen, Joshua 5 and 6, this is hands down one of the most dramatic, most epic, most iconic stories in all of the Bible. This is God knocking down the walls of Jericho. Like, you're probably super familiar with it if you've been around church for any length of time. I was doing a city group visit this Wednesday night, and I told the city group, I was like, hey, this is where we're going to be this week. And immediately someone said, VeggieTales. Like, I remember that story from VeggieTales. Like, we've probably heard about this one way or another. But listen, behind this feat of God knocking down the walls of Jericho, man, God is showing us what faith or getting in the wheelbarrow actually means for all of us. As one of my preaching pastors used to say when I was in seminary, man, one of my goals today is to try to put some shoe leather on this for us, okay? What does this actually mean for what faith looks like in our lives today? One big caveat before we really jump into this thing, it's like I told you a couple of weeks ago, man, we've got to keep this front and center. We've got to bear this in mind, that this whole story right here in Joshua 5 and 6, this is primarily about salvation. It is primarily pointing us to Jesus here. It's like the primary point is not just be like Joshua. It's not dare to be a Daniel. It's not, hey, I can move mountains like Moses. That's not the primary point of any of these things. It's like I told you a few weeks ago, man, the bad news of Joshua 5 and 6 is that we're not Joshua. Man, we are Jericho. Jericho, listen, it's the citadel of our sin. This is the thing that stood between us and the promised land of our salvation, and there was nothing that any one of us could do about it. Just go read Ephesians 2. So along comes Jesus, the truer and better Joshua, who through the counterintuitive, humble obedience of the cross, he overcame that barrier for us in our place. So his final cry of it is finished, that's what brings down the walls of sin and death that held us captive. That's ultimately what this thing is pointing to, that our sin was Jericho. Jesus was Joshua who destroyed our sin all by himself, without any one of us so much as lifting a finger to help him. So Jesus accomplishing this, that's the main point. But just like anything else in the Bible, it's also about more than that. And so today I want to draw out what we could say is four, what you could say, basics of the faith. All right, 4 basics of the faith. We can learn 4 specific things here that I just want to call the Jericho rules for us. 4 basic things that this shows us. We're going to walk through 2 chapters, okay? So buckle up. We find ourselves in Joshua chapter 5. Joshua is on the eve of his first major challenge as a leader of Israel. Chapter 3, they make it across the Jordan River. In chapter 4, this was, last week, they're told to put up these memorial stones, stones of remembrance. And now here they are staring at this land, staring at Jericho. Between the children of Israel and the promised land is the mighty city of Jericho. Jericho at the time, it was possibly, we don't know, but it was possibly the most fortified city in the world. Archaeologists, there's a lot of archaeological work that's been done at the site. They say that, man, the walls were so thick that you could probably race 2 chariots around the walls. So the scene here in Joshua 5 is taking place on the eve of this battle. We don't know exactly when, maybe a week or 2 weeks out from this moment. So as you can imagine, okay, Joshua's pretty nervous, okay? War is imminent. This is his moment right here as a leader, his first true moment. Everybody's probably thinking, Moses was awesome. Do you have what it takes to fill his shoes? One of the things I love about Redeemer City is that 99.9% of us all share a hatred for the Alabama Crimson Tide. God, can I get an amen? It's just universal. No matter what team you cheer for, you're cheering against them. It's awesome. I love it. Go Dogs. And listen, but here's the deal. The legend Nick Saban retires, right? And then you've got this other guy, Kalen DeBoer, who comes in, and everyone's thinking, do you have what it takes? The pressure's got to be just unimaginable, right? This is Joshua. And on top of that, if you just look at your Bible in chapter 5, just kind of look at the section headings that are there, you're going to see that God made them do 2 things that just seemed odd, if not actually insane, when they're supposed to be preparing for a battle, okay? The first thing God makes them do once they get across the Jordan after the stones is he commands all the men to be circumcised. And listen, here's the deal, all right? If I know I'm going into battle in 2 weeks, at the top of my list to get done before the battle, it is not, hey, I need to go get this taken care of. I need to go get circumcised. That is not one of the things that I'm thinking about that needs to happen in the 2 or 3 weeks leading up. I'm I need to plan. I'm a pastor. I studied theology. I don't know how to fight. I need to learn how to fight. I'm thinking these people have been wandering around in the wilderness. They're not trained soldiers. And so literally, just as Israel got up to Jericho, and it's right there in their face, God has Joshua circumcise all the male soldiers. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the details of circumcision. Praise God for that. Your city groups are going to talk about that this week, okay? But here's the deal. Needless to say, it would have left them feeling very vulnerable, right? It's just a couple weeks out. We don't know how to fight. What's happening here? And then after that, God makes them observe the Passover meal, which is the equivalent of him saying, hey, instead of planning this whole thing out, how about y'all just have a worship service? Let's just worship me. Why? Why? I was reading it over and over again. So I was this is insane. If you practically think about it, the problem with us is we're just too familiar with this stuff, right? And we don't think about how insane this actually is. And the reason this is here for us in chapter 5 is to show us the first rule of Jericho, is that in the Christian life, identity always comes before activity. It always comes before. Identity comes before activity. This is one of the hardest and I think most confusing parts of the Christian life. Because all of us, man, we want to jump to the what. What is it that God has in front of me? What am I supposed to be doing? Man, we want to jump to the how. How is this going to get done? How am I going to get through this? How is God working in this? We jump to the what, we jump to the how, and man, God is warning us of something here because he knows that, man, if we center our lives on the what, if we center our lives on the how, then we are going to center our identity. We are going to define ourselves by the what. And he's saying, I don't want you to define yourself by the what. I'm calling you here in chapter 5, before you do anything, to define yourself by the who. Who is this God? I don't want you to define yourself by how much you compare to the other nations. I want you to define yourself by me and my might and my power. And we need to know this because God, right here in chapter 5, the whole point of this is that God, again, this is an overflow of the gospel. God grants us our identity as a gift in the gospel to us. It is a gift to us. That's what circumcision and the Passover and the memorial stones were all about. That in every way, our due in the Christian life, the what of the Christian life for you, it begins at the end of his it is finished. It begins at the very end of his done. Your due begins at the end of his done. We have to remember that. This is what God is saying, chapter 5. We have to remember that. Because the persistent temptation for them and for us is that you would remove your eyes from what God has declared over you. That you'd stop remembering what God has said to you, and you would begin to build your identity in your life on your circumstances. You would build your life on how you compare to others or how well you've lived in comparison to other people, that you would build your life on the what and not the who. This is our greatest danger. Write this down. I told you this all through our study in the Gospel of John, but I think it applies here, that Satan in the Christian life, man, he starts with what you did or what's been done to you, and he tears down who you are, your identity. But Christ starts with who you are. That is chapter 5. I'm starting with who you are and what I've declared you to be in me, and then I'm going to repair what you did by the power of my Spirit. That's the gospel. And it's only, listen, here's the deal. It's only an awareness of God's acceptance, an awareness of his promise, an awareness of our identity and what he gives us that then gives us the ability to actually live the Christian life. For the Christian life, not just to be, man, I'm defeated and miserable all the time, but I'm stepping forward into the promises of God. This is the foundation for everything. Because listen, no guy was going to feel like fighting after chapter 5. I can tell you that. Amen, guys? None of them are going to feel like fighting. It almost feels like God is trying to intentionally disadvantage Israel. And just take a step back and think about, man, your own walk with God. And how many times you're like, God, it seems like you've called me to do this, this, and this. So if that's true, then why do all these things keep happening? It feels like you're intentionally maybe disadvantaging me in some of the things that you've actually called me to walk in. This feels insane, is my point. I mean, God could have given these commands to them at any point he wanted to. They've been in the wilderness for 40 years. Man, I'm almost 40. It feels like the blink of an eye, but my kids remind me that it's not, okay? They've been there for 40 years. Why didn't he do it right before they crossed the Jordan? Any of this stuff. Why didn't he do it 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 6 months ago? Why wait until they're right up at the walls to leave them in this really vulnerable place? I think you know the answer. It was to show them that victory and strength did not belong to them. That this is about the who before it's ever about the what's. That this was God's battle, not theirs. And what God wants from them, what he wants for us, this is the Christian life, it's surrender. It's not a show of strength. God's saying, I demonstrated my strength for you on the cross. And now I'm just asking you to trust me and surrender to my finished work for you. And God's going to actually double down on this. He's going to go a step further. Look at verse 13. So when Joshua was by Jericho, it says, by the way, that word by in Hebrew, it means right up next to the walls. So Joshua's out by himself at night, right up next to the wall. It's just like me when I was in high school. Man, I was not a good student in high school. A lot of my teachers are like, how did you become a pastor? How did you get your PhD? We just don't understand how this could happen. Because for me, when I was in high school, listen, every time I had a test the next day, you know what I was doing all night, the night before. Man, I was studying, trying to learn everything I was supposed to learn over the last 3 or 4 months. I'm cramming, trying to get this done. That's kind of like what's happening right here. Joshua is at the walls, probably trying to figure out, what am I going to say to Israel? I don't know what to do. How are we going to get in here, trying to figure something out? And then all of a sudden it says he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? So can we first acknowledge here? Joshua appears to be a man's man, okay? Let's just get that out of the way. He appears, he is right by the enemy wall at night, and some guy comes walking up to him with a sword in his hand. a lesser man like me, I would have hightailed it out of there. I would have been gone. Like, he wouldn't have even seen me. I would have run so fast. But Joshua, he's most likely 70 or 80 years old at this point. He goes over and actually challenges this dude to a fight, right? He's like, are you for us or for our adversaries? Come on, bro. So you can write this in your Bibles. Joshua is the truer and better Rocky Balboa. He's like, I'm not going to be an underdog. Like, I'll fight here. Some people wear Superman pajamas. Superman wears Joshua pajamas, okay? That's for free. And Joshua said to him, so are you for us or for our adversaries? And the man said, no. No. Again, Joshua did not ask him a yes or no question. He asked him an either or question. Are you for us or for our adversaries? And again, the guy says, no. It reminds me of when my kids do that thing where they try to trap me in some kind of yes or no question. They do this all the time, as if I have already agreed to do something that they want to do. Like just a few weeks ago, they're like, hey, Dad, are we going to get ice cream before lunch or after lunch? And I'm like, wait, did I promise that we were going to go get ice cream today? And I'm learning that my kids are just like natural gaslighters, you know? I don't know where it comes from. It must come from their mom. But listen, as I've gotten wiser as a parent, I've learned to just tell them no, like, hey, you're asking the wrong question. That's what the guy says to Joshua. Wrong question, Joshua. So he says, no, but I'm coming as the commander of the army of the Lord. I have come. The question, Joshua, is not, am I on your side? The question is, are you on my side? The question, again, it's about the who, not the what's. This is all about identity. Like, are you going to look to me or are you going to trust in yourself? He's like, I'm not coming as a lieutenant here. I'm coming as the general, that I don't work for you. You work for me. So Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped him. Here's what it says. He says, what then, this is Joshua talking to him, what then does my Lord say to his servant? At this moment, Joshua's like, okay, the commander of the Lord's army is here. He's told us to go and take the city. And so clearly he's going to give me the plan, right? Verse 15, the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. Man, he's looking for a battle plan, but all God says to him is worship me. You want to know where the battle plan starts? It starts by us humbling ourselves and worshiping God. Maybe, here's the deal, for us, maybe the thing that we are just so desperate for God to tell us the why, to tell us the how and the battle plan, maybe it starts by us just simply worshiping him. This is what Joshua does. By the way, who exactly is this that Joshua is talking to? A lot of people would say, this has got to be an angel, right? But y'all, this cannot be an angel. Because it says that Joshua worshiped him, and whoever this strange man is, he lets Joshua do it. He lets Joshua worship him. And here's the deal. Angels in the Bible, they never let you worship them, ever. In Revelation 22, for example, the Apostle John, when he fell down to worship the angel who was giving him all of these visions, the angel says, what are you doing? I'm a creature just like you. Worship God only. But this man says to Joshua, very good. And also take off your shoes too, because my presence here makes this ground holy. This is what theologians call a Christophany, which means that this is a pre-nativity, Old Testament appearance of the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, of Jesus, right here in human form. This is Jesus, if you will, before he was conceived in Mary's womb. And I just want you to think about that for a second, because there's an awesome thought here. That before Jesus was born as a helpless baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, that he was and he is the commander-in-chief, in fact, of the Lord's armies. So the question is never, whose side is he on? The question is always whether we are on his side. Again, this is about the who. This is about identity before activity. These are his battles. These are his battles he calls us to join him in, not our battles that he comes to just assist us in, to be our assistant in. Chapter 6. So it says, now Jericho was shut up on the inside and the outside because of the people of Israel. None went out, none came in. So the Lord said to Joshua, see, I've given Jericho into your hand with its king and all of its mighty men of valor. Joshua's like, great, okay, I hear that, but it doesn't look like that at all, because all I see is a giant city sitting right in front of me. So then the Lord proceeds to give Joshua all the instructions for how he's going to take Jericho. But again, here we go again, the instructions are odd, if not absolutely insane, to say the least. The Lord tells them to put the Ark of the Covenant out in front of them. Again, we talked about this in depth a couple of weeks ago, but the Ark of the Covenant is this little tiny tabernacle, if you will, that contained the presence of God. To put that in front of you, he says, and then to march around the city. Put the ark in front of you, march around the city once a day for 6 days in total silence. And then on the seventh day, I want you to march around the walls 7 times. And at the end of the 7th time, I want you to shout. And then at the end of it, man, I'll take care of the rest. So again, our problem here is that we're just too familiar with this stuff, okay? Don't lose sight of how absolutely bizarre and humiliating this probably is. The army of Israel, okay? Man, they're trying at least to get amped up for this fight, and they feel like God just keeps getting in their way, but they're trying to get amped up for this fight. You've got Joshua who's itching to prove himself, and God just tells them, hey, I want you to march silently around the walls 13 times. And then on the 13th time, I want you to shout. That's it. I mean, just imagine here if this was a football game, okay? Your team, which is being coached by a brand new coach, you're down by 3 points. You're right there at the end zone, 2-yard line, 5 seconds to go, okay? And then the brand new coach, who everybody is wondering again, can he prove himself? He pulls you aside and he says, all right, guys, no offensive play right now. Here's what we're going to do. I want you to go up to the line of scrimmage. I want you to look at the defense. I want you to hold hands and sing Away in a Manger. That's what I want you to do. This is our plan to score and for me to prove myself. This is insane. How hard must have had this been for Joshua? He's looking to prove his mettle as a general, but God says this. He says, I want you to walk a bunch of newly circumcised soldiers around these walls and sing to them. Like, it's just odd. Which shows us the second thing, is that the Christian life is not something we do for God. It is an invitation to life with God. Christian life is not something God says, hey, I started it, I need you to go finish it. It's not something we do for him. It is an invitation to life with God. That's the message of the whole Bible. It's Emmanuel, God with us, and him inviting us into this life with him. Now, listen, you may have noticed, but this has been a major thing that I've been emphasizing really since the last fall. The reason is because I'm having to relearn this myself. As someone who is super type A and an achiever and I'm go, 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 I'm always focused on the what. Man, God is trying to remind me of this. That Christianity is not what I can go do for Jesus. Man, it is Christ in me. It is Christ in you. It is Christ through you. And this just totally changes the question. It's hard for a lot of us to lean in and to rest in this. But man, it changes the whole equation of your life, that it is no longer about what do I have to do to try to get God on my side. That our circumstances and the things that we've walked through and experienced no longer are the barometer at which God is on my side or not on my side. The question is, as Joshua shows us, man, what does God want me to do with wherever I am, with whatever I have, with wherever he has placed me, and how do I just simply join him in that? C.S. Lewis said that coming to Jesus, it's a lot like living in an old rickety house where there's a lot of leaks and a bunch of things that are broken, and so, man, you send for the repairman Jesus. So Jesus comes and he gets to work fixing all the leaks and patching up the roof and unplugging the drains, and you're like, this is awesome. Like, this is why I got saved. This is why I got baptized. Like, Jesus is delivering me from all these things. He's doing all these things. But then you walk with Jesus long enough, you'll see this. Without warning, he takes out a sledgehammer and he starts tearing down walls in your house. And you're like, wait a second, God. Like, I've literally spent the last 2 decades of my life building this wall. You can't touch that. You're like, wait a second, God, like, my parents gave me this. They told me this. This is something that's been so true to me, and you can't touch this, God. But he begins getting out this sledgehammer, and he's just patiently standing there waiting, and what he does is he starts tearing these things down. And you're like, what is happening? This is not what I wanted. And then C.S. Lewis says this. It's one of my favorite passages he ever wrote. He says the explanation is that, man, God, he is building quite a different house from the one that you ever imagined. It looks different than the what that you might have had in front of you. He launches out a new wing here. He puts up an extra floor there. He runs up towers. He starts making courtyards. You see, you thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace, Redeemer City, and he intends to come and live in it himself. This is the gospel. That God had a better plan for Joshua than just helping him win a battle. God has a better plan for you too, and it starts with surrendering to him as the commander. So let me ask you, man, how do you typically relate to God? Because I say for many of us, we typically look at God like our faithful lieutenant, like our very important and spiritual assistant, that he's there to influence and guide and comfort and care for us and get us through tough times and help us to get to heaven whenever we die. And I think God is in all of those things, but he comes first into our lives as the commander of the army. He comes first as Lord. We say it all the time here at Redeemer City, man, he's either Lord of all or he's really not Lord at all. And that means that, man, the point of this is not, man, what do I need to do to keep him on my side? Because if you see your life as primarily yours and God is there just to assist you with whatever the whats are that are in front of you, the question is always going to be like Joshua's. God, are you for me? What do I need to do to keep these blessings flowing and to keep this tap open? Just tell me what I got to do. Do I need to give more? Do I need to serve more? You know, like, I know sin is off limits, but what are the really bad sins that tick you off? How do I stay away from those and I can tolerate these? God, it feels like by grace you grade on a curve, so this year in 2025, how do I go from a D to a C to a B? We're always going to be thinking in these patterns. But if you see the Christian life as you following Jesus, then the only question you're going to have is, where does he want me to go? Like, because the point of it is the who. It's not the what. And so I don't have to give him 10% of my money so that he'll bless the rest. For 100% of it, I just simply ask, what does he want me to do with this? With my time and my talent and my resources, all of my life is a gift. How do I begin to leverage these things for his kingdom? We don't give him 1 or 2 weeks here, 1 or 2 days at church every week so that he'll bless the rest of our week, but he owns 24 hours of all 7 days of the week. It's all his. And so we don't come to solicit God. It's not the Christian life. It's not trying to appease and solicit him. We're just simply asking God, where do you want me to follow? And believe it or not, this is incredibly comforting. Let's return to Charles Blondin for just a second. Blondin, he crossed the Niagara Falls over 300 times. And rarely was he ever able to get a volunteer to jump into that wheelbarrow with him. Rarely, but not never. Once he put his manager, Henry Colcord, on his back and carried him across the falls. And while his manager was climbing on his back, Blondin told Harry this as he climbed on. He said, "Listen, Harry, for the next few moments, you are no longer Harry Colcord. You are Charles Blondin. As I cross over, you are a part of me, mind, body, and soul. Don't worry about the falls below. I've got that. Focus on me. When I sway, you sway. Just rest in me and do what I do." My goodness, when I read that, I thought, that's the Christian life. This is Christ in me. This is the good news of Joshua 6, that we can now rest in him. The waterfall of God's wrath, it won't be poured out on me because it crushed him already. That, man, we won't be touched by evil because it already pierced him. So we can rest in him. We can simply obey him now. So where do you feel like life is out of control? Man, where do you hear the roar of the waterfall beside you or underneath you? Man, what the message of Joshua 5 and 6 is, don't look down at the waterfall. Look up to Christ, who is now carrying you. You're one with him. The Christian life is not something we do for God. It's an invitation to life with God. The third rule is that in the Christian life, obedience often seems crazy. Right, we've already talked about this one a good bit. Obedience, man, it often seems crazy. There's so many things that God could have gotten them to do to show this kind of faith, right? I mean, here's an army marching around the city in silence, and not to be too graphic, but they're probably still walking around in kind of an awkward way because of the circumcision. This was not an awe-inspiring sight here to behold. But here's the deal, because of the crazy nature of these instructions, all of this is intentional. That's what I want you to see. It's all intentional. Because so many things that Jesus commands us to do in the Christian life, it seems crazy, right? It seems so counterintuitive. And by that, listen, I know that many of you might be feeling really gratified right now, but I'm not referring to a bunch of weird Christian rituals that some Christians engage in, right? Okay, there's no shortage of advice out there, kind of wacky Christian advice on how we can try to procure God's blessing in our lives, okay? When I was growing up in the 90s, if you wanted God's blessing in your life, all you had to do was bring all your secular music to youth group, and we break it right there, okay? This was the key, right? I think I still, in my home church, I still hold the record for the amount of times I had to break the same CD that I just kept buying year in and year out, and I'd just bring it back the next year, and we'd break that thing again. It was Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. Every time my dad found it, he said, boy, take that thing to youth group. We're getting rid of that. Not in my house. Well, there's all kinds of stuff like that, and I'm not talking about things like that. I'm talking about the counterintuitive way of the cross here. That's what I'm talking about. It feels crazy. Like responding to someone who has wronged you with forgiveness instead of vengeance. Everything in your mind says vengeance is the way that I'm going to feel better and make this right. But Jesus says, be humble, forgive, because vengeance belongs to me. And I'm telling you, if you've ever been deeply and truly wronged, that feels crazy. It sounds crazy, but here's the thing with forgiveness, man, it comes the power of God. Man, the power of God comes into our life. It begins to invade our relationships. Or think about the Sabbath, right? This is the hardest one for a type A achiever like me. You think I can't afford this time-wise to take a day off? I can't get done everything I need to get done in 7 days, much less 6. It makes no sense. But then when you start to do it, you'll see that God, he begins to multiply your time and your energy. Or you think about something like tithing. You say, man, I can't afford to tithe. But then when you begin to lean into the things that God has called us to do, he begins to multiply contentment and peace in our lives because we're putting his kingdom before our kingdom. Or you think about, man, being patient in a situation where you feel like giving up. Like you feel like I'm just going to throw in the cards. Or you think about, man, being patient in a situation where you're like, I've been walking and walking and walking and nothing's happening. And so I'm just going to run in there and do this thing myself. Because it seems like God told me to do it and I think I'm doing what he told me to do, but nothing's happening. So I'm just going to run in here and take care of this myself. Man, that's putting the what before the who. You see, here's the deal. Man, all of this is so counterintuitive. All we need to do is just simply surrender our lives, our careers, our family, where we are. We surrender that to him, and then we don't really even have to ask God to bless it because everything that he calls us to step into, it comes pre-blessed. When we simply say, God, your will be done, not my will be done. And Jesus, he's the preeminent model of this crazy countercultural obedience right here because he overcame evil not through a display of strength and power, not by forcing all of his enemies into submission, but he overcame evil and the devil himself through his own submission and weakness on the cross. It was right there that he unmasked evil. He stripped it of its power and overcame the curse of death. And now he looks at us. Man, it's all an overflow of what he has already done, and he says, follow me. It might look crazy, it might feel crazy, but follow me. So because of the cross, I can trust God. You can trust God. Man, in all of your walking, in all of the laps, you can trust him. However long it feels, however lonely it feels, however silent it seems that God is, I just look back to the cross. And I can see his face, and I can hear his voice. Which brings us to the fourth rule. It's endure. Endure. Because God's redeeming hand is at work in our long obedience in the same direction. And we endure not because we're trying to show our strength. We endure because we know, as Pastor Jared said earlier, that the steadfast love of the Lord is following us. That his redeeming hand is at work in the wake of, man, our crazy counterintuitive obedience to the way of the cross. I mean, just think about this. Halfway through the 6th lap on the 7th day, the walls look no different than they had the first day. Just think about that. I mean, there was no indication even. Go back and read chapter 6. There's no indication that Joshua even told them what day or when the walls were going to come down. He simply says, hey, go start doing this. And then he says, on the day that I tell you, then they will come down. Listen, every day they had to walk, seeing absolutely no progress at all. And I mean, if I were God, and I wanted the people to stay motivated, I would have at least had a couple of bricks fall, right? Like a couple of things just to let them know, like, hey, like I get it, this is kind of crazy, and like you don't understand what's happening, and like here's a little brick that's gonna fall off the top, just to let you know, man, you're on the right track. But it was nothing, like nothing, until the 7th lap on the 7th day when it just all came crashing down. But here's the deal, isn't this the way that our lives feel so often? That you're obeying and man, you're doing all the right things, but you're just not really seeing the fulfillment of the promises that you think should be happening in your life. In fact, sometimes you're like, I'm obeying, and God, it feels like I'm seeing actually the opposite of that. I'm reading the Bible, and I just don't see any change in my life. And you're like, am I getting any better? Like, is it that I don't know how to read? Is it that God isn't real? You're trying to raise your kids the right way, but they keep doing stupid stuff, and you keep doing stupid stuff, and it's like this vicious cycle, and you're like, how do we ever get out of this? You're trying to be what you should be in your marriage, but man, your spouse isn't changing, or you try to do the bigger and better thing, the godly thing, and forgive that friend or neighbor or coworker, but they're not forgiving you back. They're persisting in anger and resentment and bitterness towards you. And so, man, you prayed and you prayed and you prayed and you prayed, and it just feels like, man, there's just no change in my life. And you're like, God, come on, at least let me see a couple of bricks fall here. At least give me some kind of sign. But God is saying to us right here, but see, I want you to walk by faith and not by sight. I want you to walk by faith in who I am. Go back to Joshua 5. Remember, I'm the God of deliverance. I'm the God who's making all things new. I need you to walk by faith in the midst of this season, in the midst of this thing, trusting that, man, this God right here, he is with you. And he has not left you or forsaken you. That even when he's working, even when we can't see it, he is working. We sing it all the time. He never stops working. He never stops working. Write this down, in fact. Endurance is faith expressed over time. Endurance is faith expressed over time. God is saying, you're going to have to believe that I'm working even when it doesn't look like I am. Because it's easy to have big moments of faith and in a room like this or in a service or in a city group. But man, faith of what we're learning here in Joshua 5 and 6, man, it's saying, I believe, God, you're working. I believe in your promise, like you said, even though I don't see it. I'm trusting in you. Because you see, sometimes the reason God asks us to walk without seeing results is because he wants our faith to be less focused on the outcome and more focused on his promise. He wants our faith to be focused on the who and not just the what. Outcomes are his responsibility. Faithful obedience, man, that's our responsibility. To lean into his promises, man, to rest, man, in the life of Christ, in the finished work of Christ. You see, listen, no changes may have been happening in the wall while they were circling it, but I can guarantee you, I've been in places like this in my life, I can guarantee you that a whole bunch of changes were happening in them, that God was doing something in them. Because the reality is that God wasn't just preparing the promised land for them, but he was preparing them for the promised land. And every lap, every step, it reminded them that it was God's strength. This is God's strength and his alone that could win this battle and not ours. And listen, I imagine that, man, had God knocked down those walls the first time on the first lap, man, I know myself. They would have forgotten, right? You'd get 2 weeks in. You'd be telling stories around the campfire. Man, remember what we did? Man, we showed up. And when we showed up, man, look at all the things that we did. Man, so thank God for the extra laps. Because the long, lonely laps of unfulfilled promise and desperate prayers is where God is infusing his promises into us. He's infusing the promised land into us. The reality of the Christian life, as I've told you, is that, man, God is not just taking you to heaven. He's trying to put heaven inside of you. The hope of heaven. And the promises, the peace, the joy of heaven. And man, I feel like a lot of this, man, this is for some of you in the room today that feel like, man, I'm just walking. Man, I'm doing laps over and over. I'm just walking circles. And you're trying, but the whole time you're wondering, God, listen, how much further do I have to go? Like, how much longer is this going to be, God? And Jesus just simply looks at you, he looks at us, and he says, be steadfast. 1 Corinthians 15, be steadfast, be immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because my cross, he says, my cross and my resurrection shows you, man, that God always brings resurrection after the cross of obedience. It's what he's doing. And that means in your life that the real loneliness that you feel in these laps of walking, the despair, injustice that you feel, that you experience, suffering that comes into your life, the insecurities that we carry around, the condemnation that our enemy throws in our face, trying to look at what we do and tear down who we are. All that means that, man, we might feel these things, we might experience these things, but his cross and his resurrection means that they won't have the final word, church. It won't have the final word. Because wherever we, his children, follow him, his redeeming story is taking shape. It's taking shape in our lives, not by our strength, but by his strength. And the hope is that renewal is coming. He's bringing it. He will cause us to mount up on wings like eagle. And he is bringing and doing something in our lives that we can never imagine. So wherever we as children say to him, whatever we say to him, I want you to know what this tells us right here is that, man, God hears us. He doesn't ignore us. He doesn't sweep our requests and our needs under the rug. In the apparent silence of the fourth lap and the fifth lap and the sixth lap, in the apparent silence of all these laps, he's working. He's there. He listens. He is with us because he knows. Listen, here's the deal. He knows that we need him. We don't just need another mountain to climb. We don't just need another what? We need a heavenly Father. This is how he comes to us. The commander of the Lord's army says, I've come to deal with that shame. I've come to deal with the sin. And I've come to bring you back into the presence of your heavenly Father. So every tear we've cried, every prayer we've uttered, as I told you last week, only two things I know in the Bible that God keeps. He keeps our prayers and he keeps our tears. He keeps those like precious jewels. Throughout 21 days of prayer, I read a couple of books on prayer, and I haven't been able to get past this one paragraph I read a few weeks ago. It says, every prayer we've ever whispered, from the simplest throwaway request to the most heartfelt cry, God has collected it like a grandmother who scrapbooks a toddler's finger paintings and scribbles. God has treasured up every prayer we've ever uttered, even the ones that we have forgotten. And he's still weaving their fulfillment together, bending history in the direction of a great yes to us. That is unbelievable. Bending history, does that sound outlandish to you? Does it sound too good to be true? I mean, it does to me. But what else does Jesus' second coming mean, if not the full restoration of justice and peace on earth and our salvation? What else are we hoping for, church, if not the fulfillment of God's promises here on earth as they are in heaven? And so when God brings that final restoration on earth, the book of Revelation in chapter 5, it tells us that, man, in heaven, there's this golden bowl that God has. And in this bowl, he's keeping our prayers. He's collecting all the little prayers I prayed as an 8, 9, 10-year-old. He's collecting the prayers I'm praying right now as a 38-year-old. He's collecting all of them, all of our prayers. But he doesn't just collect them, he collects them for a purpose. Because at some point, God is going to tip that bowl over. All of our prayers, he's going to tip it over. And all of our prayers are going to rain down on planet Earth. At last, giving redemption and healing and all the justice, man, that we've craved for our whole lives, that he's going to bring it to pass. We might not see it in our lifetimes, but we will see it. So not one single step in following him, church, is ever in vain. Not one prayer we've ever uttered, not one tear we've ever cried, it is never in vain. So keep walking. Keep obeying. He's worthy of every step. Act like every lap is your last lap, because one day it will be, and you will be right. One day you will see the goodness of the Lord break into the land of the living. We will see it with our very eyes. endurance. It's faith expressed over time. Would you pray with me?